That evening felt much like any other as I made my way home. The exhaustion from a full day at work seemed settled deep in my bones, and climbing the 3 flights of stairs to our little apartment felt like a monumental effort. Each step up seemed to echo the weariness in my legs. When I finally reached our door, the familiar, slightly stuffy scent of home wrapped around me, and a small, hopeful thought flickered. Maybe tonight could be quiet. Just rest. That little spark of hope died the moment I pushed the door open. Mark, my husband, was settled deep into the cushions of our old brown sofa. I saw the TV remote in his hand and a nearly finished beer bottle sitting on the side table next to him. Some loud game show was playing, filling the small space, but his attention snapped to me the second I walked in. "Betty," he said, skipping any sort of greeting, "I feel like having a pie tonight." I paused, taken aback for a moment. "Mark, I literally just walked in. I'm so tired from work. Could we maybe have one tomorrow?" I tried to keep my voice even. His expression shifted, annoyance clouding his features. "You're home now. What's the difference? Just make one. It's not like it takes forever." A quiet sigh escaped me before I could stop it. I could almost hear my mother's voice in my head, reminding me to be patient, to try and understand. But honestly, it felt like the understanding and patience always had to come from my side. Still, arguing seemed more exhausting than baking. Resigned, I turned towards the kitchen, figuring getting it over with was the path of least resistance. Our apartment is compact, just the one bedroom, the living room that doubles as our dining area, and this cramped kitchen barely big enough for one person. I started pulling out flour, sugar, apples, trying to move efficiently, just wanting the task done. My hands were dusted white with flour as I worked the dough on the countertop when Mark ambled into the kitchen doorway. "Make sure it's apple," he instructed, leaning against the frame. "And don't use that pre-made crust stuff." I gave a tight little nod, focusing on the dough beneath my rolling pin. We did have a pre-made crust in the fridge, a small convenience I'd bought, but I knew better than to mention it now. So, from scratch it was. It took the better part of an hour, peeling apples, mixing the filling, carefully laying the lattice top. Soon, the warm, sweet scent of cinnamon and baking apples started to fill our small apartment, and for a minute, it actually felt comforting, almost cozy. A fragile hope returned. Maybe this pie, this effort, could smooth things over, lead to a calmer rest of the evening. But when the timer finally buzzed and I carefully lifted the golden brown pie from the oven, setting it on the counter to cool slightly, that hope dissolved just as quickly. Mark was suddenly right there, hovering. He barely waited for the steam to lessen before cutting himself a huge wedge. He took a couple of quick bites. I watched his face, seeing his brow furrow and his mouth twist downward. Then, without warning, he lifted the plate and simply tossed the slice onto our kitchen floor. It landed with a soft, messy thud. "This is awful," he declared, his voice sharp. I just stood there, speechless, staring at the ruined piece of pie, the effort of the last hour lying spoiled on the linoleum. All that effort, all the care I'd poured into making that pie after work, and this was the reaction waiting for me. My eyes stung, blurring my vision for a moment, but I blinked hard, determined not to let the tears actually fall. Not yet. What? What was wrong with it? My voice felt thin, barely a whisper, but I needed to understand. "Everything," was his sharp, dismissive reply. "You ought to know better by now." I found myself completely speechless. A cold wave washed over me, making me feel incredibly small, almost invisible, as I looked down at the ruin of the pie splattered across the kitchen floor, the shattered crust, the sticky filling. It felt like a disturbingly accurate picture of us, of everything that had become broken and messy between us. With a heavy sigh, I knelt down and began, almost numbly, to clean it up. The weight of it all, not just the pie, but years of unspoken unhappiness, felt like it was physically pressing down on my shoulders. It wasn't just about a ruined dessert, of course. It was about the thousand little moments, the lack of simple appreciation, the constant, unspoken demands, the way Mark looked at me these days, or more often, the way he didn't look at me at all. It felt like the sum total of everything. Right then, scrubbing fruit filling off the linoleum, I knew with sudden clarity that I needed to get out, at least for the night. I couldn't bear another minute in that apartment. I needed comfort, understanding, someone who truly saw me. My thoughts immediately flew to William. My brother. He's always been my anchor, the steady one. Grabbing my overnight bag and deliberately leaving the rest of the mess behind for Mark to deal with, I decided I'd stay at his place. William's home, a welcoming two-story house with a little garden out front that he fussed over, always felt like a safe harbor. As I pulled into his driveway, the porch light flicked on before I'd even cut the engine. I guess he must have heard my car arrive. The front door opened just as I reached the bottom step, and there was William, his familiar face looking instantly worried as he saw me. "Betty," he said, his voice full of warmth as he pulled me into a solid, comforting hug. What on earth happened? That hug was all it took. The tears I'd managed to hold back finally spilled over, hot and fast down my cheeks. I mumbled into his shoulder, the words choked and difficult. He threw the pie, Will. The pie I spent time making after that long day at work. He just threw it on the floor. William gently guided me inside, settling me onto the soft, familiar couch in his living room while he went to make tea. "Tell me everything," he urged quietly, handing me a steaming mug that felt warm and grounding in my shaking hands. As I sipped the hot tea, the story of the evening started to tumble out. And as I talked about tonight, older memories started to surface too, layering onto the fresh hurt. "It wasn't just tonight, though, Will," I confessed, the realization settling heavier now that I was saying it aloud. "It's felt like this for years, really. I just kept telling myself things would change, you know? That eventually, he would change back somehow. Remember way back when we first met him at Jenna's party? He really knew how to turn on the charm back then, didn't he?" I murmured, mostly to myself. William nodded, his agreement gentle but clear. "I remember that," he said. "But Betty, sometimes people wear masks for a long time. Eventually, though, you see what's really underneath." "I suppose that's true," I conceded, feeling a familiar ache start in my chest. When Mark and I first got married, things felt so different, so much lighter. We'd find any excuse for a date night. We laughed until our sides hurt. We could talk about anything for hours and hours. It felt easy, but somewhere along the way, maybe over years of small shifts, he began to change. Or perhaps, I added with a sigh, I just started seeing the person he'd been all along, the one behind the charm. I noticed William looking intently at me as he asked, "He wasn't always like this." I shook my head, the motion feeling heavy. "No, not like this. Of course, we had disagreements, little arguments like any couple. But it wasn't this constant tension, this harshness. Over time, it felt like his expectations grew impossibly high, and his criticisms became sharper, more frequent. I can't even pinpoint when exactly I started feeling like I had to constantly watch every step, every word, afraid of setting him off." William let out a long breath, a sound that seemed to echo my own fatigue. "Thinking back," he said quietly, "Mom and Dad certainly had their share of arguments, but Dad never, ever treated Mom with that kind of disrespect." "I know," I whispered, the sting returning to my eyes. I blinked hard, trying to keep the tears from spilling over again. That's part of what hurts. I remember how Dad treated Mom, even when they were upset. I kept thinking, maybe foolishly, that I could somehow get through to Mark, make him understand how deeply his words and actions were cutting me. I tried explaining. I tried changing my own approach, hoping something would click for him. But it felt like nothing I ever did was sufficient. Nothing was ever quite right in his eyes. William looked at me then, his gaze steady. "Betty," he began softly, "that's not how love is supposed to feel. You can pour all your energy into someone, but you can't force them to change, especially if they don't even recognize that their behavior is the problem." I lowered my eyes, focusing on the swirling pattern in my lukewarm tea. Taking another small sip, I thought back again. I remember Mom and Dad arguing sometimes, vividly even. But Dad always came back. He'd apologize, genuinely, and you could feel he wanted to make things right again. Mark just doesn't. There's never an apology, never that moment of repair. Silence settled between us for a moment before William spoke again, his voice earnest. "Betty, you deserve so much more than this. Remember when we were just kids? All those silly promises we made about looking out for each other? Well, I meant it then, and I mean it now. I'm right here. You really need to start thinking about what you need, about finding your own happiness again." His words resonated deep inside me, settling somewhere quiet and profound. I nodded slowly, absorbing the truth in them. A realization, slow but undeniable, was solidifying within me. This life, the one I was living with Mark, wasn't the one I had dreamed of or the one I deserved. I longed for respect, genuine affection, and simple care. Things that had become painfully clear Mark was unwilling or unable to give me. "You're right," I finally breathed out, the admission both difficult and freeing. "I can't keep going on like this. I have to make a change. It's time." I felt the comforting pressure of William's hand squeezing mine. "Whatever you decide," he promised, "I'll be right there with you, every single step." Later, the early morning sun began to stream through the thin curtains of William's spare bedroom, painting stripes of light across the unfamiliar walls. It felt quiet, safe, and overwhelmingly uncertain all at once. I woke up slowly, stretching under the covers and feeling a kind of deep-down restedness I hadn't experienced in ages. Making the decision about Mark, about the divorce, had been incredibly hard, but admitting it was necessary felt like setting down a heavy burden. Even so, a little flutter of apprehension remained. Relief mixed with the undeniable scariness of stepping into the unknown. The aroma of coffee drew me downstairs, and I found William already there, moving around the kitchen with a comforting familiarity. "Morning, sis," he offered, his smile warm and steady as always. That smile helped. "Morning," I replied, sliding into a chair at the dining table. He set a plate down in front of me, scrambled eggs and toast. Simple, solid food. "You need to eat," he said gently. "Big day today." I nodded, picking up my fork though my appetite felt shaky. "I know," I managed a small bite. "I'm nervous, Will. Definitely nervous. But," I added, meeting his gaze, "I also know deep down this is the right thing. The right thing for me." He settled into the chair across from me, holding his coffee mug. Just having his calm presence nearby was grounding. "Ending things is never easy," he acknowledged quietly. "But you don't have to go through it by yourself. Remember that. I'm right here with you, all the way." Hearing him say it so plainly offered a small measure of comfort. Once breakfast was done and the plates were cleared, William drove me to the lawyer's office. The drive felt quiet, the silence punctuated only by the hum of the engine and the slightly too loud beat of my own heart. As we parked, I took a deliberate, slow breath, trying to gather myself for whatever this next step involved. Inside the professional-looking office building, we were greeted by Mrs. Harris. My initial impression was of a rather stern woman with very sharp, observant eyes. However, as soon as she began to speak, her tone was unexpectedly kind, softening her expression. "Betty," she said, looking directly at me, "I understand this is a very difficult time for you. Please know that my job is to guide you through the legal process and ensure your interests are fully protected." "Thank you," I whispered, feeling a surprising surge of gratitude wash over me. Just hearing her professional reassurance felt helpful. The meeting itself felt quite long, filled mostly with stacks of paperwork and explanations of legal jargon that sometimes swam before my eyes. Mrs. Harris, though, was remarkably patient. She carefully explained every document, making sure I grasped what my rights were and what the path ahead would look like. I did my best to stay focused, trying to absorb all the crucial details. The days that followed turned into weeks, and life seemed to become a constant whirlwind of appointments, follow-up meetings, and more paperwork. It felt like I was always either preparing for something or recovering from it. Amidst all this activity, the strangest part was Mark's absolute silence. I had mentally prepared myself for pushback, maybe anger or arguments, but there was nothing. The papers were served, I knew that, but he didn't sign them, nor did he formally contest them. No calls, no texts, no messages through mutual friends. It was as if, in relation to this divorce, he had simply ceased to exist. That complete lack of reaction wasn't comforting. Instead, it felt deeply unsettling, like waiting in the dark for a sound you can't predict. One evening, curled up on the sofa in William's quiet living room, the unease finally bubbled up. "It's just so strange, Will," I found myself saying, looking over at him. "Mark hasn't done anything. Not one single response. No angry voicemails, no late-night texts, nothing. It's just silence. What am I supposed to make of that? It feels like he just dropped off the face of the earth." William paused, a thoughtful look crossing his face. "Well, it's certainly strange, considering how intense he was just a little while ago. Then again, he added, offering a small measure of hope, maybe he's taken a hard look at things and decided it's time for him to actually let go and move forward. I really hope that's true, I murmured, letting out a slow breath. Still, a tiny knot of doubt remained stubbornly tied in my stomach. Life, however, didn't pause. I threw myself into finding a new place to live. More than just needing different walls, I craved a genuine fresh start. A space entirely my own where I could begin putting the pieces of my life back together, free from the constant reminders and heavy atmosphere of the past. The search took a few weeks, involving countless listings and viewings, until I finally walked into this one particular house. It felt different immediately. It was airy and welcoming, filled with sunlight streaming through big windows, such a complete opposite to the cramped, shadowy apartment Mark and I had shared. Something just clicked inside me the moment I crossed the threshold. A quiet certainty settled over me. This felt like the place my new beginning could actually take root. When William came to see it, his face lit up the second he stepped inside. "Betty, this is absolutely perfect for you. It feels like you, a real home base." Walking him through the empty rooms, my imagination already filling the spaces, I started sharing my ideas. "I'm thinking of painting these living room walls a soft, pale blue, you know? And I definitely want lots of plants, maybe right here by these sunny windows." A low chuckle escaped him, warm and familiar. "You've already got it all mapped out, haven't you?" "Sounds lovely, truly." Getting settled in was surprisingly uplifting. William and a couple of close friends pitched in, and amidst the chaos of boxes and furniture, the house swiftly began transforming into my home. Each evening, coming back from work felt like returning to a quiet harbor, a personal sanctuary where I could finally breathe easily and unwind. That wonderful sense of peace, however, proved fragile. One evening, completely ordinary until that moment, I arrived home to find my front door slightly ajar. An icy trickle of unease snaked down my spine. My hand trembled slightly as I pushed the door open wider, stepping inside with hesitant quietness. The air felt wrong. What I saw next stopped me cold, making my breath catch in my throat. There he was. Sitting in my living room, at my dining table, was Mark. My heart hammered against my ribs as my eyes darted around, taking in the scene. His bags and various belongings were strewn across the floor nearby as if he'd simply moved in. A sickening wave of trespass washed through me. This was my space, my carefully constructed haven, and his presence felt like a physical violation. "Mark, what on earth are you doing here?" My voice came out sharper than I intended, though I fought to keep it from shaking. He glanced up, and there was this unsettling combination in his expression. A certain self-satisfaction lingering in his eyes, coupled with a hardness around his mouth that felt like pure, stubborn defiance. His words, claiming our house, hit me like a physical blow. Our house? We were technically still married, yes, but the life we'd shared felt like a distant, unpleasant memory. "But I found and bought this place." "After we separated," I heard myself say, my voice sharper than I intended. "This has absolutely nothing to do with you." I watched him lean back in my chair, a familiar, condescending sneer twisting his lips. "Doesn't make a difference," he stated, his tone laced with false authority. "As your husband, legally, I have every right to be right here." The sheer arrogance of it made my stomach churn. Just as I was trying to process his audacity, the sound of the front door opening again made me jump. It was Anna, my next-door neighbor, her face unusually pink, her eyes darting nervously between Mark and me. "Oh, Betty, I'm so terribly sorry," she stammered, clearly uncomfortable. He showed me his driver's license and a copy of your marriage certificate. He insisted he had a right to enter. I wasn't sure what else I could do." Poor Anna looked mortified, caught in the middle of this mess I hadn't created but now had to endure. A heavy sigh escaped me. "It's all right, Anna. Really. This isn't on you." My gaze snapped back to Mark, my frustration simmering. This man, who had caused me so much pain, was now invading the sanctuary I'd painstakingly built for myself. "You need to leave now, Mark," I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite the trembling I felt inside. "This is my home. You don't live here anymore." He actually chuckled, a low, grating sound that sent shivers down my spine. "You might want to reconsider that, sweetheart," he drawled, his eyes glinting with malice. Because I plan on staying. And just so you know, if you even think about trying to force me out, I'll make sure the divorce proceedings drag out, and I'll fight for half of absolutely everything. His threat hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The sheer nerve of him left me momentarily speechless, a cold wave of panic washing over me. I felt trapped, backed into a corner within the very walls that were supposed to be my refuge. But showing him fear? No, I couldn't give him that satisfaction. I needed to project strength I didn't entirely feel. Fine, I managed, forcing a calm I was far from experiencing. You can stay for tonight. But first thing tomorrow morning, I'm contacting my lawyer. We'll let the legal system determine exactly who has the right to be in this house. A smug smirk spread across Mark's face. Go right ahead, he replied, his confidence infuriating. Bring it on. I'm not going anywhere. A wave of exhaustion and defeat washed over me. Arguing further felt pointless right now. I needed space, distance, a moment to think clearly. Without another word, I turned and walked towards my bedroom, the weight of his presence feeling like a physical burden. I closed the door firmly behind me, the click of the lock sounding unnervingly loud in the sudden quiet. My safe space felt violated, tainted by his presence just outside. I needed a plan, support. My hands shaking slightly, I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and dialed William's number. Will, I whispered. The tears I'd been holding back finally starting to form, blurring my vision. It's Mark. He's here, at my house. He says he has a right to be here, that he can stay. I could almost hear the anger tightening William's voice through the phone, mixed with immediate concern for me. Okay, Betty, just try to stay calm, he urged, his voice a reassuring anchor in my panic. Don't engage with him anymore if you can help it. I'm leaving right now. I'm on my way. After I put the phone down, my hand was trembling slightly. I leaned against the hallway wall, pressing my palm flat against my chest, trying to quiet the frantic drumming of my heart. Mark, showing up like that, making those outrageous demands. It sent a jolt of pure shock through me. It felt like a ghost from a past I thought I'd buried had suddenly materialized. But William's calm reassurance over the phone echoed in my mind, offering a tiny spark of hope amidst the sudden fear. Just a few minutes later, I heard his car pull up, followed by the sound of the front door opening and closing. Then, silence downstairs, punctuated only by the low, indistinct murmur of male voices. I strained to hear, catching snippets but not enough to understand. An anxious energy seemed to creep up the stairs, tightening the air around me. It felt like hours passed before I heard footsteps ascending. William appeared in my doorway, his expression unusually grave, which immediately set my nerves on edge again. Betty, he said, his voice low and serious. There's something important you should know. He paused, letting his words sink in. When we initially purchased this house, I took a precaution. I made absolutely certain the deed was registered solely under my name. I had this nagging feeling back then that Mark might eventually try something exactly like this. From a legal standpoint, he has absolutely no claim on this property. A huge, shuddering breath escaped me, one I hadn't realized I was holding. It felt like a physical weight lifting off my shoulders, the tension draining away in a sudden rush. Pure, unadulterated relief washed through me. Oh, Will, I managed, my voice thick with emotion. Thank you. I honestly have no idea what I would have done if you hadn't been here, if you hadn't thought ahead like that. He stepped forward and enveloped me in a firm hug. It felt grounding, solid. We're family, Betty, he murmured against my hair. That means we look out for one another. Always. The simple gesture, the conviction in his voice, meant the world right then. It made me feel less isolated in this mess. The following morning felt different. Armed with the official property documents William had retrieved and, more importantly, his steady, unwavering presence beside me, I felt a renewed sense of resolve. We went downstairs together to face Mark. When William calmly presented the papers, showing the indisputable proof of ownership, I watched Mark's face closely. The confident, almost sneering look he'd worn the night before completely vanished, replaced by a sort of pinched frustration. He clearly saw his gambit had failed. He had no legal footing whatsoever. This isn't finished, Betty, he spat out, the words sharp with resentment, before turning abruptly and leaving. The following days melted into weeks. Gradually, the jarring memory of Mark's intrusion began to fade, feeling less like an immediate crisis and more like a bad dream. Yet, beneath the surface calm, the implied threat in his parting words lingered, a subtle undercurrent of unease. William and I both knew this wasn't truly over, and we certainly weren't prepared to simply wait and see what Mark might try next. One quiet evening, maybe 2 or 3 weeks later, we were sitting in the living room. The house was peaceful, but I noticed William looking at me with an intensity, a seriousness, that was quite unusual for him. It made me sit up straighter. "Betty," he began slowly, "I've been doing a lot of thinking lately. We really need to anticipate any potential moves Mark might make down the line. He's proven he can be completely unpredictable, and I don't want us caught off guard again." I nodded slowly, feeling a familiar knot of anxiety tighten in my stomach. He was only voicing the worries that had been whispering at the back of my own mind. "I know," I agreed softly. "I've been feeling that too. But what can we actually do about it?" William hesitated for a moment, drawing in a slow, deep breath as if steeling himself. "Well," he said, meeting my gaze directly, I took a step. "I've engaged the services of a private detective. I thought it was important to get a clear picture of what Mark has actually been doing since you two went your separate ways." I just stared at him, completely taken aback. A private detective? The idea had never even crossed my mind. A private detective, Will? The question slipped out, my voice perhaps a little tighter than I intended. It just sounded so drastic. Did we truly need to involve someone like that? I watched his face as he explained, talking about a persistent gut feeling. This need he had to ensure we were completely prepared for whatever Mark might throw our way. That protective instinct of his, always so present, was something I held dear, even amidst this current turmoil. It was part of why I trusted him so implicitly. So, despite my own reservations tingling beneath the surface, I gave a small nod. "All right, Will, I understand. What did this detective manage to find out?" He reached into the worn leather satchel he carried everywhere and pulled out a manila folder. My breath caught slightly as he began laying the contents across the small table between us. Photographs, official-looking documents. A cold knot started forming deep in my stomach as I looked closer. The pictures were of Mark, caught in various moments with several different women. A couple of the faces stirred vague, unpleasant flickers of recognition from the life I was trying so hard to leave behind. Then, one specific paper drew my eye. It was clearly a police report. A woman's name I didn't know was listed as the complainant against Mark. He actually did this? The words felt foreign, a shaky whisper heavy with disbelief. I lifted my gaze to meet William's, seeking confirmation or denial, but the grave seriousness in his eyes told me everything. He quietly confirmed that Mark's recent behavior seemed far from respectable and suggested this unsettling information might be the very thing we needed should Mark try to escalate his tactics against me. A turbulent mix of feelings crashed over me then. A hot surge of anger at his deception, followed quickly by a wave of deep, aching sadness, and underneath it all, the sharp, bitter sting of betrayal. How could the man I once thought I knew have become someone capable of this? How had he sunk to such a level? Lost in the emotional whirlwind, I barely felt William gently place his hand over mine on the table, a small, grounding touch amidst the chaos swirling inside me. "We'll navigate this, Betty," he murmured, his voice a low, steady anchor. "We're in this together." His quiet presence offered a much-needed sliver of comfort. It turned out William's foresight was incredibly valuable. Only a few days passed before a stern, official-looking letter arrived, forwarded from my old address. It was from Mark's attorney. My hands started to shake as I read through the lines filled with frankly outrageous allegations about shared assets I knew weren't really shared and completely fabricated stories about our life together, culminating in threats of legal action. The sheer audacity felt like a blow, but then I looked over at William, who stood beside me, his expression calm and unwavering as he read his own copy. He met my anxious gaze, his own eyes clear and resolute. "Are we ready for this fight, Betty?" he asked, his tone firm but reassuring. "We have the evidence now. He can't intimidate us with baseless threats." His solid confidence was contagious, helping to steady my own trembling nerves. With William's unwavering support bolstering my courage, we arranged another appointment with Mrs. Harris, I sat trying to appear composed as she carefully read through the aggressive letter from Mark's lawyer, her own face remaining professionally impassive. Next, she methodically reviewed the evidence the detective had gathered. The photographs that made my stomach churn, the police report that spoke volumes. The silence in her comfortable office seemed to stretch on forever, each second amplifying the anxiety tightening in my chest. Finally, she set the papers down and looked directly at me. "Based on this, we have a very strong case here," she stated, her voice calm and measured. "Mr. Thompson's claims seem largely baseless, especially considering the evidence you've brought forward. We will draft an appropriate and firm response. Please try not to let this distress you too much." A profound sense of relief washed over me, easing some of the tension I hadn't even realized I was holding. Still, despite her reassurance, the looming prospect of actually facing Mark in a courtroom environment felt utterly daunting, casting a long and decidedly unwelcome shadow over everything. I felt the familiar knot of anxiety tighten low in my stomach, a constant companion these days. Then, William's hand found mine, his fingers closing reassuringly around my own. I drew a shaky breath, looking over at him. His quiet promise, "We've got this. I won't let him hurt you anymore," was a balm, though the fear was never far beneath the surface. I knew Mrs. Harris had officially sent our response, detailing Mark's actions and disputing everything he'd claimed. It felt like a necessary step, pushing back after feeling so cornered. But taking action just shifted the tension. Now began the agonizing wait. It felt like the ball was in Mark's court, but honestly, we were the ones holding our breath. Those first few days stretched into weeks, each one a slow-motion exercise in anticipation. So many evenings dissolved into conversations with William, tracing the lines of possible outcomes, trying to brace ourselves for whatever Mark might do next. His steady presence beside me, his unwavering belief that we'd get through this, was the anchor I desperately needed. It gave me just enough courage to get out of bed each morning. It was a particularly dreary Tuesday evening, rain lashing against the windows, creating a cozy, albeit slightly melancholic, backdrop. William and I were settled on the sofa, trying to lose ourselves in a movie, seeking a few hours of escape, when a sharp, unexpected knock echoed through the house. We looked at each other, surprise clear on both our faces. We weren't expecting anyone. My pulse quickened with a vague unease as I paused the movie and walked to the front door. Peering through the peephole revealed nothing, so I cautiously turned the lock. Standing on the porch was a woman I didn't recognize, utterly drenched by the downpour, her face pale and her eyes startlingly red, as if she'd been crying for hours. Her voice trembled slightly as she asked, "Are you Betty?" I felt a prickle of apprehension, but nodded slowly, trying to keep my own voice even. "Yes, I am. Can I help you?" "Who are you?" She drew a ragged breath, raindrops still clinging to her hair and clothes. "My name is Jenna," she managed, her gaze meeting mine hesitantly. I was involved with Mark. Recently." My heart seemed to stop for a second, then kick back into a frantic rhythm. Involved with Mark. Now. A wave of conflicting emotions, shock, dread, a strange sort of pity for the woman shivering on my doorstep, washed over me. "Come in," I urged, stepping back quickly and gesturing her inside, out of the miserable weather. "Please, come in and sit down." Once she was settled hesitantly on the edge of the armchair, dripping onto the rug, Jenna started to speak, her voice gaining a little strength. "I only met Mark a few months back," she explained, twisting her wet scarf in her lap. "He was so charming at first, you know? Swept me off my feet. But it didn't take long for things to change, for the other side to come out. Then I heard things, whispers about his past, about you. I felt like I had to find you, to warn you." "Warn me?" The thought echoed numbly in my mind. After everything that had already happened, what more could there possibly be? A cold knot formed in my stomach. Jenna's composure crumbled again, fresh tears spilling over and tracing paths down her rain-streaked cheeks. "He got so aggressive," she choked out, the words tumbling over each other. "Controlling, possessive, scary. And he talked about you constantly. Said you destroyed his life, ruined everything for him. He kept saying he wanted revenge, that you deserved to pay." I saw William's expression shift beside me, his usual calm replaced by a hard, serious line around his mouth. "What kind of revenge?" he asked, his voice low and steady, cutting through the charged atmosphere. Jenna hesitated, her eyes dropping to her nervously twisting hands in her lap. She seemed reluctant to say it aloud. He talked about ruining you financially, she finally whispered, the words barely audible above the drumming rain. He mentioned having friends, people who could make things disappear, make trouble for your business, your accounts. A heavy silence descended on the room then, thick and suffocating. The only sounds were the relentless rain outside and Jenna's quiet, shuddering breaths. Her words hung in the air, feeling colder and more menacing than any vague threat before. This wasn't just about emotional torment anymore. This sounded calculated, targeted. I felt a different kind of chill seep into my bones as the specific nature of Mark's vindictiveness, the potential real-world damage he intended, truly began to sink in, leaving me feeling exposed and terribly afraid. The silence between us felt heavy, almost suffocating, until William's voice finally cut through it. "This has to stop," he stated firmly, his words echoing the turmoil inside me. "We can't just stand by while he goes on hurting people like this." Hearing him articulate it so plainly resonated deeply. A wave of startling resolve washed over me, pushing aside some of the constant, lingering fear that had become my shadow. I met his gaze, managing a slow nod. "You're right," I agreed, my own voice emerging steadier than I'd expected. "He needs to be exposed for what he is. Everyone deserves to see the man hiding behind that charming facade he perfects." The weeks that followed were a blur of focused activity. Working alongside William felt like a partnership forged in grim necessity, and Jenna bravely shared more details of her own painful experiences, adding weight to our cause. It was a draining, sickening task, meticulously gathering the evidence of Mark's deceptions, tracking down proof of his financial manipulations, uncovering the extent of his secret affairs. Each new piece of information felt like uncovering another layer of rot, confirming the horrifying depth of his betrayal. It became agonizingly clear that my own suffering wasn't unique. Jenna's story was just one reflection of the widespread pain he'd inflicted. Looking at the substantial, damning pile of documents and testimonies we'd accumulated felt both vindicating and overwhelming. It was during one of our late-night sessions, surrounded by paperwork, that William voiced what I think we both knew was the unavoidable, terrifying next step. "We have more than enough," he said, his expression etched with seriousness. "It's time to involve the authorities. He needs to finally answer for what he's done." Stepping through the heavy glass doors of the police station felt utterly surreal, like walking into a scene from someone else's life. My heart was pounding against my ribs, a frantic, uneven rhythm caught somewhere between a paralyzing fear that this would all be dismissed and a fragile, desperate flicker of hope that we might finally be heard. Will anyone actually take us seriously? Will they see the truth in the papers clutched in my hand? The questions swirled, making me feel slightly dizzy. We were guided into a small, plain office where we met Detective Rogers, the officer assigned to review our report. As William and I carefully, methodically explained everything, laying out the documents and walking him through the timeline, I watched the detective's face intently, searching for any sign of disbelief or dismissal. He listened with a quiet, focused intensity, his gaze sharp and missing nothing, interjecting only occasionally with precise, clarifying questions. The air in the small room grew thick with unspoken tension. It felt like hours crawled by before he finally leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable until he spoke. "This is significant evidence," he stated, his tone measured and professional, yet carrying undeniable weight. "We'll definitely be launching a full investigation based on this information. From what you've presented here, it certainly appears Mr. Thorne has been involved in illegal activities." A small, cautious measure of relief washed through me, though the knot of fear in my stomach didn't entirely dissolve. Everything seemed to accelerate after that meeting. The subsequent days dissolved into a kind of hazy, stress-fueled whirlwind. I vaguely recall snippets, phone calls, more questions, the feeling of waiting for a shoe to drop. Then came the news, delivered almost clinically, that the police had acted swiftly, taking Mark into custody on several serious charges. Suddenly, his name and face were everywhere, splashed across local news websites, discussed in hushed tones, spreading like wildfire through the community grapevine. The charismatic man I had once promised my life to, the man whose actions had become a source of deep-seated terror, was finally being unmasked, his carefully constructed image shattering for the world to see. Months slowly ticked by, following his arrest and the ensuing public fallout. Logically, with Mark confined behind bars, I should have felt completely safe, utterly liberated. And yes, there was an undeniable, profound sense of relief, like a heavy shroud lifting from my shoulders, allowing me to breathe a little deeper. But it wasn't quite that simple. A persistent, insidious anxiety remained, a cold undercurrent fueled by vivid memories of Mark's arrogant boasts about powerful friends, those shadowy figures he always claimed would always have his back, ready to protect him no matter what he did. That specific fear lingered, a chilling possibility that kept me looking over my shoulder. I remember the exact evening it happened. I was pulling into my driveway after a long day at work, feeling drained and just wanting the solace of home. But as the car rolled to a stop, something felt jarringly wrong. My mail wasn't tucked neatly in the box. It was scattered haphazardly across the porch floor, envelopes ripped and askew. My gaze immediately shot to the front door. Near the lock, there were fresh marks. Small, ugly scratches and gouges in the paint and wood that definitely hadn't been there that morning. It looked disturbed, tampered with. A cold wave of pure panic crashed over me, making my breath catch in my throat. Oh God, no. Was this them? Was this one of Mark's despicable friends sending a warning? My hands started shaking uncontrollably as I fumbled in my bag for my phone, my fingers barely obeying as I dialed William's number, the only person I could think to call. Will? I managed to choke out as soon as he picked up, my voice trembling so badly I could hardly speak, I think. I think someone tried to break into my house. The door. Okay, stay right where you are. Stay calm, William's voice came through the phone, blessedly firm and grounding, cutting through the edge of my rising hysteria just enough for me to gasp a shaky breath. Don't go inside the house. Lock your car doors. I'm on my way right now. I'll be there as quickly as I possibly can. Doing as he said, I clicked the locks and sat rigidly in the driver's seat, eyes glued to the violated front door. Every familiar shadow in the yard now seeming to shift and menace. The wait stretched out, feeling agonizingly long, each minute thick with fear. Though in reality, it probably wasn't more than 15 minutes before his headlights swept reassuringly into the driveway. I watched, heart still pounding, as he got out and walked directly to the porch, carefully examining the scattered mail and then crouching down to look closely at the doorframe and lock, his expression growing progressively more grim. After a moment, he straightened up and turned back towards me, still huddled inside the car. His look confirmed everything I feared. You were right, he said gravely, walking over to my window. It definitely looks like someone tried to force the lock. It wasn't successful, but we absolutely need to get your security upgraded, immediately. We didn't hesitate. The very next day, and over the few that followed, William was instrumental in helping me coordinate everything needed to make the house feel less like a target and more like a fortress. It was a surreal and deeply unsettling process, having serious discussions about the throw length of deadbolts, the optimal placement of motion sensors, and the viewing angles of security cameras for the home that was meant to be my safe haven, my personal sanctuary. We ended up installing a comprehensive new system, far more advanced than anything I'd had before, with multiple high-definition cameras covering every entrance and sensitive perimeter alarms. While I oversaw the technicians drilling holes and running wires, a part of me felt proactive, like I was reclaiming some control, but another, larger part, felt profoundly invaded and saddened that such measures were even necessary because of Mark and the lingering shadow he cast. Still, as the final system check was completed and the monitors flickered to life, knowing those electronic eyes were watching brought a small, fragile measure of security back into my rattled existence. One quiet evening, while William and I were running diagnostics on the new security system he'd helped install, a sudden piercing alarm shattered the calm. My heart leaped into my throat. We both instinctively turned to the monitor, and my breath caught. A shadowy figure was moving stealthily near the edge of the garden. It felt surreal, like watching a scene from a movie, but the fear tightening my chest was entirely real. Before the man could even approach the house, though, flashing blue lights appeared down the street. The security company had automatically alerted the local police. Seeing them arrive so swiftly and take the man into custody sent a wave of immense relief through me, followed by a surge of thankfulness for William. His practical insistence on upgrading the security hadn't just been cautious. It felt like he had actively erected a shield around me, preventing another terrifying intrusion into my life. The very next day, my phone rang. Detective Rogers. Betty, he said, his voice professional but serious. We have the individual from last night. He's making claims, says someone named Mark hired him. We're still verifying everything, of course. Hearing Mark's name in connection with the break-in attempt felt like a physical blow, confirming the gnawing anxieties I hadn't wanted to fully acknowledge. Even behind bars, his reach felt disturbingly long, his desire to control and inflict pain apparently undiminished. A few days drifted by in a haze of unease before another call came, this time from Jenna. Her voice was tentative. Betty, I wasn't sure whether to tell you this, but I think you should know. I braced myself. Mark's been making calls from prison, she continued, the words tumbling out faster now. He's trying to get people on his side, painting a completely false picture of you, spreading, well, lies. A cold knot formed in my stomach, tightening with a familiar mix of anger and exhaustion. Thank you for telling me, Jenna. I appreciate you letting me know, I managed, my voice steadier than I felt inside. He thinks he can keep doing this, but he won't succeed. I wouldn't let him rewrite my reality or poison people against me any further. Later that evening, while we were discussing the latest developments, William looked thoughtful. Betty, he began, leaning forward slightly. We can't just keep reacting. We have tangible evidence now. The attempted break-in, the detective's information, Jenna's willingness to speak up about the lies. We have more than enough. He paused, then met my eyes. Maybe it's time to take control of the narrative. Let's go public with your story. The idea was daunting, exposing myself like that, but a part of me recognized the potential power in it. So, the following week unfolded in a blur of activity. William, with his network of contacts, helped arrange a press conference. The response was immediate and surprisingly large. The room was packed when we arrived, filled with journalists and cameras, a sea of expectant faces. Walking towards the podium, my legs felt unsteady, and I could hear my pulse drumming in my ears. Taking a deep breath, I gripped the sides of the lectern. Good morning, everyone, I began, my voice trembling only slightly. I'm here today to share my experiences. It's not just about exposing the cruelty I endured with Mark, but also about offering a sliver of hope, of solidarity, to anyone who has ever felt trapped or silenced in an abusive relationship. I recounted my journey, starting from the deceptive charm of our early days, through the escalating control, the chilling incident with the pie, Jenna's recent revelations about the smear campaign from prison, and finally, the attempted intrusion just days before. As I spoke, laying bare the painful truths, an almost unnerving silence settled over the room. Every single person seemed focused, listening intently. When I finally concluded, there was a brief pause before the questions started, gentle at first, then more direct. Given recent events, do you still perceive Mark as a danger? A reporter near the front asked. Looking out at them, I felt a surprising surge of clarity. Yes, I believe the potential for harm is still there, I replied, finding a firmness in my voice I hadn't known I possessed. But I refuse to live in fear. I won't allow him, or anyone else, to intimidate me ever again. Another journalist raised their hand. How do you feel about him now, after everything? The question hung in the air. I considered it for a moment, searching my own heart. Honestly, I said slowly, I mostly feel a sense of pity. To carry so much anger, to be so consumed by the need to inflict pain, he must be living in a deeply unhappy, miserable place within himself. The response after the press conference was something I could never have anticipated. My phone and email were flooded with messages, notes of support, encouragement, and startlingly often messages from other women, sharing fragments of their own hidden struggles. It was humbling and incredibly moving. Speaking my truth, it seemed, had inadvertently struck a chord, perhaps even sparked something larger. That evening, sitting quietly with William, processing the day, I felt a profound lightness, as if a heavy, invisible weight I'd been carrying for years had finally begun to lift from my shoulders. Thank you, Will, I said, the words feeling solid and true in my mouth. I feel like today, I really took back my power. Will offered a warm smile, the kind that reached his eyes. You always had it inside you, Betty, he replied gently. Maybe you just needed a little nudge to see it again. The very next morning, Will dropped by unexpectedly. My heart gave a little jump, wondering what it could be. I've got some news, he announced, and I noticed a definite spark in his expression. Do you remember the man who broke in? I nodded, a shiver tracing its way down my spine despite the time that had passed. The fear from that night was something etched into my memory. How could I possibly forget? Well, he began, leaning in slightly. The court handed down his sentence. With all the evidence they had, it's clear he won't be causing trouble for anyone for a very, very long time. A profound wave of relief washed over me, so strong it almost made my knees weak. Just hearing those words felt like a heavy weight lifting off my chest. Oh, Will, that's really good to hear. And that's not all, he added, his tone still serious but holding a note of finality. They've also moved Mark. He's been transferred to a high-security facility. Given his recent behavior and the kind of people he knows, the authorities are making sure he stays put. Overwhelmed, I reached out and hugged William tightly, clinging for a moment. Thank you, I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. Thank you for everything. For being here, especially when I felt so completely alone. He returned the hug firmly. That's what family does, he said simply. We stick together. The weeks gradually unfolded into months, and slowly, tentatively, my life began to find its rhythm again. I started spending more time with friends, letting their easy companionship soothe the frayed edges. I even found the strength to start a small support group, wanting to create a space for others who'd been through similar nightmares. Eventually, I even felt ready to cautiously start dating again. On my birthday, I decided to have a small gathering at my place. As I looked around the living room, filled with the faces of people who cared, William, dependable Jenna, friends both old and new, some from the support group, a quiet realization settled over me. I saw just how far I'd managed to come. The scars from the past were still there, of course, but they felt different now. Less raw, more like reminders of strength, slowly being overlaid by the warmth and happiness of new moments. Late that evening, as the last guests were trickling out, William sat down beside me on the sofa. He watched me for a moment, then said softly, "You've navigated all this incredibly well, Betty." I met his gaze, surprised by the sudden sting of tears in my eyes. It wasn't sadness, but gratitude. I couldn't have done it without a little help from my friends, I admitted, my voice slightly wavering. He gave a low chuckle, a comforting sound. "Always," he affirmed,